used to make a living chasing ghosts, but the truth is, I never really believed in them. To me, a ghost was just a story someone told. Every monster, every ghoul, every devil in the darkness was at the end of the day just a person wearing a mask made of folklore and fear. That was my professional opinion, at least. It was an opinion that got me by, right up until I took a job in Blackwater Port, a forgotten little fishing town with a local legend about a thing that jumped over rooftops. I went there looking for a man in a costume, a simple hoax to fill a few pages for a check. What I found was that some legends aren't mere stories at all. And I learned that the most terrifying thing in the world isn't discovering that monsters are real, but realizing you've just reminded one that it exists. The town of Blackwater Port, Massachusetts had a smell. I decided this as I rolled my rattling car down the main street, windows cracked despite the October chill. It wasn't just the brine of the Atlantic, a smell I knew well from my misspent youth on the Jersey Shore. This was older and deeper. It was the scent of wet slate, diesel fumes from the fishing boats, and something else. Something like old, damp paper. It was the smell of secrets. A town that smells like a forgotten library, I thought. A line that was probably too poetic for the clickbait rag I wrote for, Supernatural Uncovered. I could already see the headline they'd slap on my piece. Demon Jester terrorizes New England town. Click to see the exclusive photos. I let out a sigh, the sound fogging a small patch of the windshield. 10 years ago, I was chasing down corrupt city councilmen for the Boston Globe. Now, I was chasing ghosts for a paycheck that barely covered my alimony, and the cheap whiskey I was trying so hard to forget I liked. Blackwater Port was the kind of town that time had tried to polish, but had only managed to scuff. Grand Victorian houses, once the proud homes of whaling captains, now sagged under the weight of their own history. Their intricate fretwork peeling like sunburnt skin. The newer buildings, a hardware store, a diner, a one-screen movie theatre showing a film that had been out for 6 months, looked temporary, like squatters on land that belongs to the past. And over it all, a low grey sky pressed down, threatening a drizzle that would make the whole town weep. My ignominious pilgrimage was for a story that was, even by my standards, utterly absurd. Over the past 3 weeks, 3 separate incidents had occurred, all bearing the same bizarre hallmarks. A figure, described as a tall man in a dark cloak, had accosted residents in their own yards. He didn't rob them. He didn't assault them, not in the conventional sense. He terrorized them. He'd leap from the shadows, his face obscured, sometimes described as having glowing eyes, and then bound away, clearing impossibly high fences and even rooftops in a single, spidery leap. The local paper, a weekly pamphlet of town gossip and high school football scores, had dubbed him Spring-Heeled Jack, a name dredged up from the foggy annals of Victorian London. My editor, a man named Stan who communicated exclusively in all caps, had seen the AP wire mention it and immediately shot me an email. Get to Blackwater Port. This is gold. Don't screw it up. I parked in front of the Blackwater Port Police Department, a squat brick building that looked more like a post office. Inside, the place smelled of stale coffee and bureaucratic despair. The man behind the front desk looked up from his newspaper, his face a roadmap of weary skepticism. "Help you?" "Rick Hollister, I've got an appointment with Sheriff Brody." Sheriff Frank Brody was a big man, running to soft in the middle. With kind eyes that didn't quite match the cynical downturn of his mouth. He looked, I thought, like a man who'd seen too many good people do stupid things. "Mr. Hollister," he said, shaking my hand. His grip was firm, a working man's grip. "Come on back, don't mind the mess." His office was a cramped space, dominated by a large map of the town and its sprawling, wooded outskirts. Pins of different colours were stuck in it. Red, blue and yellow. 3 of them. "So," Brody began, sinking into his creaking chair. "You're the ghost hunter." "I prefer investigative journalist," I said. A line I'd used so many times it tasted like ash in my mouth. "Right, well, whatever you are. I'll tell you the same thing I told the fella from Channel 7. We have an unknown subject. A Class A misdemeanor for trespassing and menacing. That's it. This spring-heeled Jack nonsense is just noise." He said the word noise like it was something foul he'd stepped in. 3 victims, Sheriff. All describe something pretty far from a simple trespasser. One of them, Mrs. Gable, said he cleared her 8-foot privacy fence like it was a garden gnome. Brody ran a thick hand over his face. "Alma Gable is 82 years old and watches horror movies until 2 in the morning. Her fence is 6 feet tall and half rotted to boot. Look, I get it. It's a good story. But what I've got here is a jackass in a costume with a flair for parkour, getting his kicks scaring the life out of folks. He's a copycat, inspired by some internet garbage. Can I see the reports?" He hesitated, then pushed a thin folder across his desk. "Knock yourself out. Just don't go stirring things up. This town's wound tight enough as it is." I spent the next hour reading. The accounts were eerily similar. A sudden appearance from the shadows. A tall, thin figure. A dark, flowing cloak. And the jumping. Always the jumping. But there were inconsistencies. The kind that nagged at the part of me that was still a real journalist. The first victim, a teenager named Kevin, described the figure's eyes as like red LEDs. The second, a middle-aged postal worker, swore they were a hellish, fiery orange. Alma Gable, the third, had said they were cold and blue, like gas flames. Different colour LEDs, I mused. Or just the unreliable nature of eyewitness testimony under duress. I decided to visit Alma Gable. She lived in a small, tidy house at the edge of town, where the manicured lawns gave way to the tangled, dark woods that pressed in on Blackwater Port from the west. She was a bird of a woman, small and frail, but her eyes were sharp and intelligent behind thick spectacles. "He was right there," she said, her voice quavering slightly as she pointed a bony finger towards the end of her yard. "By the old oak. 1 minute, nothing. The next, he was just there, like he'd unfolded himself from the shadows." "And he jumped the fence?" "Sailed over it," she corrected. "Didn't make a sound. Landed on the other side like a cat. And his eyes, young man, they weren't lights. They were alive, burning. I walked the fence line, my shoes sinking into the damp soil. The fence was indeed about 6 feet tall, maybe a little more. Weather-beaten, yes, but not rotten. I saw scuff marks on the top rail, but they looked old. I walked around to the other side, into the narrow strip of public land that separated her property from the woods. The ground here was soft, covered in a blanket of damp, decaying leaves. I knelt, my bad knee protesting, and scanned the ground. And then I saw something. It wasn't a footprint, not exactly. It was a strange circular impression, about the size of a $50, pressed deep into the mud. And next to it, glinting in the weak afternoon light, was a small piece of metal. I picked it up. It was a curved shard of what looked like high tensile steel, maybe an inch long, snapped clean on one side. It felt unnervingly modern. I slipped it into my pocket, a cold little secret. My next stop was the town library, a Carnegie building that smelled exactly like the rest of the town. I wasn't looking for the original London legend. I was looking for a local connection. Small towns, in my experience, had long memories and their own peculiar ghosts. The librarian, a woman whose glasses were attached to a beaded chain, pointed me towards the local history section in the basement. Down in the dusty, silent archives, I found it. A leather-bound volume titled The History of Blackwater Port and Its Peculiarities. Tucked away in a chapter about the harsh winter of 1888 was a series of journal entries from the town's then constable. He wrote of a nocturnal leaper, a fiendish devil who tormented the townsfolk, appearing on rooftops and in locked gardens, breathing what was described as a chill blue fire. The descriptions were a near-perfect match for the original Spring-Heeled Jack, but with a local, homegrown flavour. The Leaper of Blackwater Port. The last entry noted that the phenomenon stopped as suddenly as it began, after a fire destroyed the old fish cannery down by the docks, a place that had long been rumoured to be a meeting spot for occultists. I leaned back in my chair, the smell of old paper filling my lungs. Brodie had called the perpetrator a copycat, inspired by the internet. But what if he was copying something much older, much closer to home? And what if the colour of the eyes, red, orange or blue, wasn't a mistake? What if it was a message? That night, the drizzle finally came, slicking the streets with a greasy sheen. I was in my motel room, a place that smelled of mildew and regret, staring at the small piece of metal on the nightstand. It wasn't from some demonic apparatus. I'd seen something similar once before, in a magazine about extreme sports. It looked to be a fragment of a carbon fibre leaf spring, the kind used in custom-built jumping stilts. Powerbocking, they called it. It seemed my perpetrator wasn't supernatural. He was a tech-savvy acrobat in a costume. A man. And men could be found. A call came in from Brodie just after midnight. His voice was grim. Another one, down by the wharf. This time he didn't just scare him. He put a man in the hospital. The scene was a chaotic tableau of flashing lights and yellow tape. The victim, a fisherman named Mac, was already on his way to the hospital with a broken arm and a concussion. His friend, a pale, shaking man named Stu, told me the story. He came out of nowhere. We were just loading the truck. He was on top of a container, laughing. It wasn't a human laugh. Man, it was high and metallic, like a recording. Mac yelled at him through a wrench. The guy just dropped, landed right in front of us. He had these claws, man. Metal claws. He'd swiped at Mac, sending him sprawling, then bounded away into the labyrinth of shipping containers and derelict buildings that made up the old wharf. I saw the claw marks on the side of the truck. 4 parallel gouges, deep and clean. Not made by an animal. They were too perfect. I looked past the police cordon, towards the hulking, skeletal remains of a building at the end of the pier. A sign, barely legible through decades of rust and salt spray, read, Blackwater Canning Company. The old cannery from the book. It clicked. A nasty, stomach-churning click. The different coloured eyes. The local legend. This wasn't just one copycat. The first attack, Kevin, with the red eyes. That had to be the new guy. The copycat of the copycat. The one who'd escalated things tonight. But Armour Gable's attacker, the one with the blue flame eyes, the one who left the spring fragment. He was copying the local legend. The Leaper of 1888. There were 2 of them. And I had a sickening feeling I knew where to find at least one of them. I slipped away from the scene, my heart beating rapidly. The old cannery loomed before me, a cathedral of decay. The windows were shattered voids, the corrugated metal walls bleeding rust. I found a side door hanging open on a single hinge and slipped inside. The air was thick with the ghosts of old fish and the damp chill of the sea. Moonlight lanced through holes in the roof, illuminating vast, cavernous spaces filled with the rusted remains of machinery. I moved slowly, trying to light the way with my phone. I heard a noise from the upper level, a metallic scrape. "I know you're here," I called out, my voice sounding pathetic in the immense space. "It's over." A figure emerged on a high catwalk, silhouetted against a gaping hole in the wall. Tall, thin, and cloaked. "Over?" a voice echoed, distorted by a cheap voice modulator. It was the high, metallic laugh that Stuart described. "Oh, it's just getting started. This town loves its monsters. I'm just giving them a new one. A better one." It was a kid's voice under the distortion. I recognized him now, from a picture in the high school yearbook I'd glanced at in the library. A quiet, nerdy kid from the AV club. The son of the hardware store owner. Someone with access to tools, materials, and a deep-seated teenage resentment. "The claws, the red eyes. That was you," I said, playing for time, moving slowly towards a rusted staircase. "You're the one who put that fisherman in the hospital." "Oh, he shouldn't have thrown that wrench," the kid giggled. "People need to learn to respect the story." Suddenly, another sound echoed from the far end of the cannery. It echoed through the air. The kid on the catwalk froze. "Who's that? Is that you, old man?" The thumping stopped. You could cut the silence with a knife. And then, from the deepest, darkest corner of the building, 2 points of light ignited. They weren't red LEDs. They were a piercing, hypnotic blue. The colour of a pilot light, of marsh gas, of a corpse's final, cold fire. A figure stepped out of the shadows. It was tall, impossibly so, and wrapped in what looked like rotted funeral shrouds. It moved with a fluid, unnatural grace, not walking, but gliding. It had no visible stilts. There was no sound of machinery. The kid on the catwalk let out a choked gasp. "No, you're not real. You're just a story." The figure tilted its head, a gesture of ancient, predatory curiosity. It raised a long hand, and from its fingertips, long silvery talons, like surgical steel, slowly unsheathed. It took a single, silent step forward, and then it leapt. It didn't bound, it didn't jump, it flew. It covered the 50-foot distance to the catwalk in a single, silent, horrifying arc, landing without a sound right in front of the petrified teenager. The boy screamed, a raw, wet sound that was cut off abruptly. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran, stumbling through the darkness, the ghost of old fish and the new, coppery smell of blood filling the air. I burst out of the cannery and didn't stop running until the flashing lights of the police cordon were a comforting, solid barrier in front of me. I never told Brody the full story. I couldn't. How do you tell a man like that his town's boogeyman was real? That the copycat hadn't revived a legend, but had woken one up? Like a fool ringing a dinner bell in the deepest, darkest part of the woods. I wrote my article. I focused on the kid, the copycat, painting him as a disturbed young man who'd taken a local legend too far. I left out the shard of metal. I left out the second figure. I left out the blue, burning eyes. It was a lie, but it was a kinder lie than the truth. Stan loved it. It got 1 million clicks. But I never forgot. I left Blackwater Port the next morning. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet, I think I hear it. The sound of metal on metal. And I remember that high, inhuman leap in the darkness, and the chilling, awful truth I'd stumbled upon. Some stories are not just stories. They're traps, waiting patiently in the dark for someone foolish enough to spring them.